What has transpired in the last 12 hours is Donald Trump announced a ceasefire, a 12-hour window given to Iran, followed by a 12-hour window given to Israel. That 12-hour window is going to expire very shortly. And before that, there have been a barrage of missiles that have been coming into Israel. Our reporter Ankit Tyagi has been getting us all details of how things are shaping up on ground as Iranian missiles continue to strike several Israeli cities. Now, what happens going forward from here on? Is diplomacy really going to have a shot? And more importantly, what does this mean for the entire region and America's role? Let's get in quick, important voices to talk more on this. Bill Drexel of Hudson Institute joins me on the broadcast, along with Daniel Block to also talk more about what this means. Daniel Block is the senior editor at the Foreign Affairs magazine. And in fact, Bill, let me start with you as things stand right now. In your assessment, how do you see the situation on ground? Even as a ceasefire announcement being made, on ground, the situation looks far from it.
President Trump seems to be very eager to present ceasefire peace news as quickly as possible. It's a very volatile situation. There's a reason why there's a sort of circumspection around diplomatic protocols that usually holds, but President Trump communicates much more directly. So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting development to see this pronouncement and then the uncertainty around it.
Daniel, let me take that uncertainty part to you. The fact that on ground the situation looks very fluid, very volatile, minutes to go before that Iranian 12-hour window ends. You have lots of strikes, several strikes coming in from the Iranian side into Israel. How do you read those? Is it meant for domestic audiences, or is it meant to also send a very strong message to the world, including the US?
Well, first I want to say I think Bill is exactly right. The US president likes to announce peace. He likes to announce that he's struck deals. And normally these types of conversations happen behind closed doors, and ceasefires are only announced until things are a little bit more formal. So we are in a moment, as you said, of uncertainty. As far as the Iranian attacks, my guess is they're intended mostly for a domestic audience, as well as to some extent for an international audience. They want to have the last word in many ways and end with a punch after having had their military capabilities degraded to a significant extent. Whether they get to have the last word, of course, remains to be seen. There are Israeli casualties from the most recent attacks, and the ceasefire is fluid. I mean, as we've said, as Bill was saying, there's still a lot of uncertainty on the ground.
There are casualties taking place. There is uncertainty on ground. Bill, which brings me to ask you, was this ceasefire premature?
It's hard for me to opine on what the conditions of the ceasefire were, and exactly, not being on the ground myself, it's also hard for me to see, the specifics of how it seems to have been undermined. Nonetheless, I think it's pretty evident that if you announce a ceasefire and there's still firing going on, then in the most obvious sense, yes, it's premature, or at least it may not have been premature as being so delicate that it wasn't worth announcing at the time. There's a kind of a spectrum of possibilities, but it continues to be a dynamic situation, and we'll have to watch any pronouncement of ceasefire closely for ways in which it may not hold.
Indeed, the ceasefire, as Bill is saying, may have been premature because on ground the situation looks far from actually being primed for a ceasefire. Daniel, what about some of the other aspects of ceasefire, which is what America has been saying, that Iran needs to come back to the negotiating table? Do you see that happening? Because the messaging from these strikes indicate that the Iranian regime is not going to be seen to be cowed down by America. But what about the negotiating discussions regarding the nuclear program?
Well, I think it could cut both ways. I have seen some reporting that suggests the Iranians offered to return to the negotiating table. as part of agreeing to a ceasefire. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. We don't know yet. But the Iranian incentives right now cut both ways. On the one hand, you could construct an argument that it makes a lot of sense for them to return to the negotiating table because they've lost so much militarily in this war. Like I was saying earlier, their capabilities have been seriously degraded. And, they're under a pretty intensive sanctions regime. So maybe in the face of all that, it makes sense for them to return to the negotiating table to see if they can get some more space and time and maybe sanctions relief. On the other hand, you can see the Iranians saying, well, clearly our system of deterrence has failed. We're very vulnerable to Israeli and US attacks. And the only way for us to protect ourselves is to get a nuclear weapon, in which case they may not return to the negotiating table, or they could return to the negotiating table in order to buy time and stall as they rush to develop a nuclear weapon. It's really difficult to say, but you're right that it's an incredibly important question, and we see evidence that both could happen.
Bill, come in there. Do you see that the Iranian calculation could also be on the other side, which is, as Daniel's saying, that who knows, they could double down on this nuclear program and defy all those announcements that have been made by the Trump administration, which has said that the Iranian nuclear program has been completely decimated?
I think that Israel and the United States have made their positions pretty clear, and they've been very direct in what they want and what they will do until they get what they want. What's less clear is with Iran's leadership layers being picked off systematically, with the kind of bruising attacks that it has suffered, and the relatively impotent response for most of this campaign. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what Iran is going to do, what it thinks it can do, and at what point it tries to double down or kind of takes a different tack.
Which also then, Daniel, brings us to ask another important question, which is that today is when President Trump will be meeting his NATO allies for the first time since this entire operation started. There's been a complete backing of Israeli strikes till now, whether it was the G7 statement and then all statements coming in from your American allies. How do you see the pronouncements coming in from NATO today when President Trump is likely to meet his allies, and this is going to be the most important thing that will come up?
Well, I think for NATO, in particular, I should say from the European states, there's been a bit of a mixed response to this. We've seen both support for the United States and its attacks on Iran. We've also certainly seen some hesitancy, some wishes that this wasn't what the United States was doing right now, that they didn't want to see escalation in the Middle East. My guess, and again, this is a guess, we don't quite know yet, is that the Europeans are going to be happy to see the United States move on from this conflict in hopes that they can get Washington to focus its attention a little bit elsewhere, to go back to some of their priorities, namely the war in Ukraine. But, until the meetings really get going and until we have a sense of what people are saying, it's going to be hard to determine exactly how they feel about all of it.
It's going to be very hard to predict there, but NATO commentary is most certainly going to come around the Iranian nuclear program. And final question to you, Bill, which is about America's role in the Middle East, something the Trump administration worked very hard to extricate itself from, but it looks like it's right in the middle of the Middle East, as they say.
Middle East is famously, perhaps the most geopolitically complicated, convoluted region in the world. The U.S. had, for many years, has wanted to reduce its role in the Middle East, to step backwards, to kind of, as much as possible, just park the issues there, to refocus its attention elsewhere. And successive administrations, and every year within each administration, somehow the Middle East keeps coming up as this area where the United States has strong interests that it needs to defend, has allies that it needs to support. And basically the United States has a very difficult time trying to extricate itself from the region. So I mean, as we've said, this situation is very dynamic. I don't see any world in which the United States is able to walk away from this and finally make its pivot out of the Middle East. I think there's still going to be a strong American interest in the region, whether the top leadership wants that or not. It's just the case that the region is complex and important and has to be managed. So yes, depending on how this situation kind of settles out, the balance of power between aspiring regional hegemons will shift, but the United States will still have a lot to contend with in the region.
Absolutely.
And I suspect a lot of activity in the region, sometimes against its own desires.